The quiet was the first thing people noticed about Silas's outpost. It wasn't the empty quiet of an abandoned place. It was a thick, heavy quiet, built layer by layer over 12 years of deliberate solitude. It was in the dust that lay undisturbed on a stack of tinned peaches from 1868. It was in the worn groove on the floorboards where Silas paced from the counter to the window, a path he'd walked 1,000 times. It was in the way he spoke more to his two horses, Dust and Echo, than to any human who might pass through on the long, unforgiving trail to the territories. His world was a fortress of silence, and he was its lone sentry. So when the sound of a child's ragged sob cut through the late afternoon heat, it was like a hammer blow to glass. Silas froze, his hand hovering over a leather bridle he was mending. He hadn't heard a child cry in a decade. Crying was a luxury this land didn't afford. He stayed perfectly still, listening. It came again, closer this time. A broken hiccuping sound, a desperate attempt to draw breath without making a noise. It was the sound of someone trying to be invisible. He laid the bridle down with painstaking slowness. His movements were always deliberate, measured, as if any sudden motion might shatter the fragile peace he had constructed. He moved to the door, his hand resting on the heavy wooden bar he always kept in place. He hesitated. Opening this door to a stranger was an invitation for trouble, for noise, for the world he had paid such a high price to leave behind. But the sob came again, and this time it was followed by a soft thud against the wood of his porch steps. It wasn't a knock, it was the sound of a body giving up. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, Silas lifted the bar. The screech of the unused iron bolt was a protest. The sun was a searing ball of orange, bleeding across the horizon, and in its harsh light sat a boy. He couldn't have been more than 12 or 13, a whip-thin frame of sharp angles and coltish limbs, swallowed by clothes that were little more than rags. He was huddled into himself, his face buried in his knees, his small shoulders shaking with silent grief. Silas said nothing. He simply stood in the doorway, a tall, gaunt shadow. The boy didn't seem to notice him. He was lost in his own world of pain. After a long moment, the boy's sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. He slowly lifted his head, and Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The boy's face was a ruin. A fresh, angry red welt ran from his temple down his cheek, swelling his eye shut. But it was the other marks that stole Silas's breath. Old scars, white and silvered, crisscrossed his skin. A long, thin line bisected his lip. A starburst pattern of puckered flesh marked his chin. They weren't the random scars of a rough life. They looked deliberate, each one a story he didn't want to read. The boy saw him then, and his one good eye widened with a fear so profound it was almost animalistic. He scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the doorway, as if Silas himself were a monster. I ain't stealing nothing," the boy stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. I needed a drink from your well. I'll go." Silas remained motionless. He'd seen fear before. He'd caused it, more times than he could count. But this was different. This was the ingrained terror of a creature that had only ever known the boot and the back of a hand. His first instinct, the instinct honed over 12 years of self-preservation, was to close the door, to slide the bolt home and let the silence reclaim its territory. The boy was trouble. Scars like that were a map of trouble, and they always led to more. He looked at the boy, now trying to push himself to his feet, wincing as he put weight on his leg. He saw the torn shirt, the dirt, the raw humiliation radiating from him, and beneath it all, he saw something else, something he recognized from the shattered faces of young soldiers in field hospitals, from the look in the mirror after the war, the ghost of a man who had seen too much. Silas's jaw tightened. He thought of the silence, of his peace, of the vow he'd made to never again get involved. Then he looked at the angry, weeping welt on the boy's face, and the vow crumbled into dust. Without a word, he turned back inside, leaving the door open. He moved to the counter, took a clean tin cup, and filled it from the water bucket. He walked back to the doorway and set the cup down on the porch, a few feet from the boy. Then he went back inside, picked up a piece of dried jerky, and set it beside the cup. He retreated to the shadows of his outpost, watching. The boy stared at the offering as if it were a trap. He looked from the cup to the dark doorway, his one good eye trying to pierce the gloom. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun dipped lower, painting the plains in hues of blood and gold. Finally, with a trembling hand, the boy reached out. He snatched the cup and drank, not sipping, but gulping it down in 3 desperate swallows. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve, his eyes never leaving the doorway. He picked up the jerky, hesitated, then shoved it into his pocket, as if saving it for a time when he was more certain of his safety. He pushed himself to his feet, his body a study in pain. He looked at the open door one last time, a flicker of something unreadable in his eye. Gratitude? Suspicion? He gave a short, jerky nod, then turned and limped away from the porch, heading not for the road, but for the relative cover of a small copse of cottonwoods near Silas's corral. Silas watched him go. He knew he should close the door. He knew he should slide the bolt and pretend the last 10 minutes had never happened. Instead, he walked over to the hook where his hat hung, a hat he hadn't worn in years. He took it down, blew a decade of dust from its brim, and placed it on his head. The moral test was over. He had made his choice, and as the first stars began to prick the deep purple of the twilight sky, he had a sinking feeling that he had just invited the entire world onto his doorstep. He spent the next hour in his usual routine, feeding dust and echo, their soft wickers the only comfort in the encroaching darkness. But his mind wasn't on the familiar task. It was on the small, huddled shape in the cottonwoods. He could just make him out, a bundle of misery trying to find solace in the night. The sound of hoofbeats reached him first, not the slow, plodding gait of a weary traveler, but the arrogant, hammering rhythm of men in a hurry, men who owned the ground they rode on. Silas didn't need to see them to know who they were. He straightened up, his back suddenly rigid. He'd heard those same hoofbeats a few days prior, when Marcus Thorne's men had ridden past, laughing as they drove a small family's cattle off the edge of a ravine. He moved to the corner of the corral, keeping to the shadows. 3 riders crested the nearby ridge, silhouetted against the last vestiges of daylight. Even from a distance, their posture was one of casual cruelty. The man in the lead was Jedediah Thorne, the landowner's son, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his cowardice, a dangerous combination. They reined in their horses a few dozen yards from the outpost, their voices carrying on the still night air. "Heard he came this way," one of the men said, spitting a wad of tobacco near Silas's fence. "He can't have gone far," Jedediah sneered. His voice was high and thin, the sound of a man who'd never been told no. "Filthy little vagrant. I want to see the look on his face when we find him." "I think I missed a spot." The third man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "You marked him up good, Jed. His own mother wouldn't know him." "She's dead," Jedediah said flatly. "Just like his father. Just like his whole pathetic unit of so-called heroes. Nothing but a pack of scarred-up freaks." Silas felt the blood drain from his face. A unit. Scarred-up freaks. The words echoed in the empty chambers of his memory, stirring ghosts he had long since buried. He saw the boy in the cottonwoods flinch, curling himself into an even smaller ball. The riders hadn't seen him yet. They were scanning the area around the outpost itself, their eyes drawn to the faint lamplight in the window. "Check the old man," Jedediah commanded, dismounting with a jangle of spurs. "Hermit like him might have taken pity, or maybe he just wants the reward for turning him in." Silas melted back from the corral, slipping through the side door of his barn and into the back of the trading post. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that belied his years. The floorboards didn't creak, the air didn't stir. He was a ghost in his own home. He stood in the deep shadows by the counter as Jedediah Thorne swaggered through the open doorway, his 2 hired guns flanking him. "Old man!" Jedediah called out, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. "I'm looking for a boy." "Scrawny thing. Face looks like a dropped pie. You seen him?" Silas stepped forward, just enough for the lantern to catch the hard lines of his face. He didn't speak. He just looked at Thorne, his eyes flat and gray as a winter sky. Thorne was taken aback for a second. He hadn't expected the hermit to be so tall, so solid. He quickly recovered his swagger. "Don't you ignore me, old-timer. My father owns this valley. That means he owns you too. Now, the boy." "Where is he?" "There's no boy here," Silas said. His voice was rusty from disuse, but it held a low, gravelly timbre that vibrated in the small room. Jedediah laughed. "Is that so? Then you won't mind if we take a look around." He took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "He stole from me. A silver locket. My mother's." Silas's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second. The lie was as clumsy as the man who told it. The boy had nothing on him but rags and a piece of jerky. This wasn't about a locket. This was about power. It was about the pleasure of the chase, the joy of inflicting pain on someone who couldn't fight back. "You're not welcome here," Silas said, his voice dropping even lower. "Leave." Jedediah's face flushed with anger. "You don't give me orders, you dusty relic." He gestured to his men. "Check the barn. I'll handle this." The two men started to move, but Silas took one deliberate step to the side, blocking their path. It was a simple movement, but it was fraught with meaning. It was a line drawn in the dust. "I said," Silas repeated, his eyes locking onto Thorne's. "Leave." For a moment, the room was thick with tension. The two hired guns looked uncertainly at their employer. They were thugs, not fools. They recognized something in the old man's stance, a stillness that was more dangerous than any threat. Jedediah, however, was blinded by arrogance. "You're making a big mistake," he hissed, his hand now gripping his pistol. Behind Silas in the deep shadows, there was a faint rustle. He knew without looking that the boy, Leo, must have slipped in through the back. He must have heard everything. Silas felt a surge of frustrated anger. The boy was complicating things, making it impossible to de-escalate. But then he saw it. A flicker of movement in the reflection of a dusty glass jar on the shelf. The boy wasn't cowering. He was moving with a quiet purpose, his small form hugging the wall. In his hand, he held a rock, not a pebble, but a heavy, hefty stone from the edge of the well. His one good eye wasn't wide with fear. It was narrowed, focused. It was the eye of a hunter. The unsettling feeling returned to Silas, stronger this time. This boy, he was something else entirely. Jedediah missed it all. His focus was entirely on the old man who dared to defy him. "Last chance, old man. Tell me where he is, or I'll burn this pathetic shack to the ground with you in it." Silas didn't answer. He just watched Jedediah, his body coiled like a spring. He was calculating angles, timing, the number of steps between the two hired guns. He was becoming the man he'd tried to kill for 12 years. "Fine," Jedediah snarled, and his hand moved, pulling the pistol from its holster. It was a blur of motion. Before the barrel of Jedediah's gun had even cleared the leather, Silas moved. He wasn't just fast. He was economical. No wasted energy. He lunged forward, not at Jedediah, but to the side. His left hand shot out and clamped down on Jedediah's wrist, twisting it with brutal surgical precision. Bone grated. Jedediah screamed, a high, thin shriek, and the pistol clattered to the floor. At the same instant, Silas's right hand grabbed the front of Jedediah's shirt, pulling him off balance and spinning him around to use as a shield. The two hired guns, stunned by the sudden violence, had their guns half drawn. They froze, their own boss now squarely in their line of fire. "Drop them!" Silas growled, his voice a lethal rasp right in Jedediah's ear. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" Jedediah wailed, his bravado utterly shattered. The two men hesitated. Then slowly, reluctantly, they let their pistols fall to the floor. Silas didn't relax. He shoved Jedediah forward, sending him stumbling to his knees. He kicked the 3 pistols into the dark corner of the room. He stood over the whimpering man, his chest heaving, the adrenaline a familiar fire in his veins. "Get out," he said, the words like chips of ice. "And if you or your father's men ever set foot on this land again, I will finish what I just started." Jedediah scrambled backward, clutching his broken wrist, his face a mask of terror and disbelief. His men, utterly cowed, grabbed him and practically dragged him out of the outpost. They half threw him onto his horse and galloped away into the darkness, their retreat as panicked and chaotic as their arrival had been arrogant. Silence descended once more, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. It was fragile, temporary. The smell of gunpowder and fear hung in the air. Silas stood there for a long time, his fists clenched, his body trembling from the violence he had unleashed. He had won. He had protected the boy. He had faced down the bully and sent him running. A false sense of victory settled over him, a grim satisfaction. He finally turned, his gaze falling on the boy, Leo, who was still standing in the shadows. The rock was no longer in his hand. He was looking at Silas, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You'll be safe now," Silas said, his voice still rough. "They won't be back tonight." He expected to see relief in the boy's face. He expected tears, or maybe even a grateful smile. He got neither. Leo stepped out of the shadows, his one good eye clear and unnervingly calm. He walked to the open doorway and stared out into the vast, dark expanse of the plains, in the direction Jedediah had fled. There was no fear in his posture. There was only a cold, patient certainty. "They'll be back," the boy said, his voice losing its childish, frightened edge. It was steady now, and much older than his years. "Jedediah will run crying to his father. He'll tell him an old hermit broke his wrist and shamed him. Marcus Thorne can't let that stand." Silas stared at the back of the boy's head. His father won't risk his men for a squabble over a vagrant boy. Leo turned his head slightly, looking at Silas over his shoulder. A faint, knowing smile touched his scarred lips. It was a smile that did not belong on the face of a child. "You're wrong," Leo said softly. "This was never about me being a vagrant. It was about seeing who in this valley still had a spine. It was about drawing the snake out of its hole." He turned fully to face Silas, his gaze direct and piercing. "We weren't running from them, old man. We were leading them, right here." Silas felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the night air. "We?" The boy's smile widened. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, listening to the night. A deep, profound stillness had fallen after the rider's departure. But now, a new sound was beginning to intrude. At first, it was just a faint vibration, something you felt in the soles of your feet more than you heard with your ears. A low subterranean hum. Then, it grew. It became a whisper, then a rumble, then a deep, rolling thunder that seemed to make the very air tremble. It wasn't the sound of 3 horses. It wasn't the sound of 10. It was the sound of an army on the move, the rhythmic, earth-shaking beat of dozens upon dozens of hooves, converging on this one, isolated outpost from all directions. Silas stared out into the darkness, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible sound. His victory over Jedediah Thorne felt like a child's game now, a foolish, insignificant prelude. He looked back at the boy. Leo was no longer just a boy. He was a harbinger. His face, illuminated by the single lantern, was calm, resolute. This wasn't a surprise to him. This was the plan. "Who are you?" Silas whispered, the words barely audible over the growing cacophony. Leo looked past him, through the back door and towards the southern ridge, where a new line of dark shapes was appearing against the starlight. "He's the appetizer," Leo stated, his voice ringing with cold clarity. "His father is the main course." He then turned his gaze back to Silas, the haunted veteran who had just broken 12 years of peace for a boy he thought was a victim. "And we," he said, as the thunder of hoofbeats grew into a deafening roar, "are the reckoning." The thunder of hooves was the sound of a promise being kept. Silas stood frozen, not from fear, but from the sudden, violent reordering of his entire world. The boy beside him was no longer a boy. He was the calm center of a storm he had summoned himself. The ragged orphan had been a mask, a piece of theater played for an audience of one, designed to test the heart of a man who thought he had no heart left. "Marcus Thorne," Leo said, his voice cutting through the roar, "commanded a volunteer unit during the war. So did my father. They were assigned to guard a federal payroll wagon moving through the mountain passes. Thorne's unit was supposed to be the rear guard. Instead, he ambushed my father's men from behind, murdered them in their sleep." Silas stared at him, the pieces clicking into place with sickening speed. A unit of scarred-up freaks. That's what Jedediah had called them. Not victims, survivors. He shot them, then set a fire to cover his tracks. Leo continued, his young face hard as granite. But the fire spread too fast. He had to flee before he could make sure everyone was dead. A few of us. We were just boys then. Drummer boys. Aides. We survived. We crawled out of the ashes. He unconsciously touched the puckered scar on his chin. "Thorne took the payroll and used it to buy this valley. He built his empire on the graves of our fathers and brothers." The hoofbeats were deafening now, resolving into dozens of individual riders flooding the plains around the outpost. Lanterns flared to life in the darkness, a ring of angry fireflies encircling them. A voice, deep and commanding, boomed across the land. It was a voice accustomed to absolute authority. "Jedediah, report!" Silas saw a figure on a powerful black horse sitting straight and tall. This was not the preening cowardice of the son. This was the father, Marcus Thorne. "He's in here, Pa!" Jedediah's whining voice cried from somewhere in the darkness. "The old man. He broke my arm. The little thief is with him." Marcus Thorne's head turned slowly, his gaze fixing on the small lamplit outpost. "Old man." His voice rolled towards them, less a shout than a pronouncement. "You have involved yourself in a matter that is far beyond your concern. You are sheltering a wanted fugitive and have assaulted my son. Send the boy out now, and I will be merciful. I will only burn your home to the ground." The sheer arrogance of the offer was breathtaking. Silas looked at Leo, expecting to see the boy readying for a final, desperate stand. Instead, Leo gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Not yet," he whispered. "He needs to commit. He needs to show the whole valley who he is." Silas didn't understand. The whole valley? The valley was asleep, cowering in their homes. But he trusted the cold certainty in the boy's eye more than he trusted his own instincts right now. He had been a soldier once. He knew a field commander when he saw one, no matter how small the package. He stepped into the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. "This boy is under my protection, Thorn," Silas called out, his voice carrying with a strength that surprised even him. "This is my land. You and your hired guns have no authority here. Ride out now, or be carried out." A ripple of mocking laughter went through Thorn's men. Marcus Thorn himself did not laugh. He simply raised a hand, and the laughter died instantly. "So be it," Thorn said, his voice flat with disappointment, as if Silas had failed a crucial test. "You have chosen to die for a ghost. A noble but foolish choice." He turned his head. "First rank. Fire at will. Turn that shack into splinters." The world erupted. A volley of rifle fire slammed into the front of the outpost, chewing through the wood. Splinters flew like shrapnel. Silas and Leo threw themselves to the floor, the air thick with the smell of cordite and shattered pine. Glass from the window exploded inwards. The tin cup Silas had given the boy was flung from the porch, ringing like a death knell as it hit the dirt. "Stay down!" Silas yelled, crawling towards an old rifle he kept under the counter. It was a relic, but it was loaded. "The south wall!" Leo commanded, his voice sharp and clear over the din. "It's got the best field of fire on the men near the cottonwoods. Don't waste shots on the men in the open, they're just a distraction." Silas paused, his hand on his rifle. The boy was right. It was a classic flanking maneuver. Thorn was using a line of men as bait while others moved into more strategic positions. He crawled to the south wall, punched out a loose board with the butt of his rifle, and peered through. Leo was right. 6 men were using the trees for cover, reloading for another volley. He took aim, the familiar weight of the stock against his shoulder a grim comfort. He exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and one of the shadows fell. He worked the lever action, fired again, and a second man cried out and stumbled back. The firing from the front intensified. Bullets ripped through the walls, tearing apart the quiet life Silas had so carefully constructed. Sacks of flour burst, coating the air in a white haze. The stack of tinned peaches from 1868 was finally knocked over, cans rolling across the floor like scattered memories. This was it. The world he had fled had found him, and it was tearing his sanctuary apart board by board. From his vantage point on a low ridge half a mile away, a homesteader named Elijah clutched the sides of his wagon, his knuckles white. He watched the muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness around Silas's outpost, each one a hammer blow to his conscience. His wife, Sarah, stood beside him, her face pale, her arm around their young daughter. "We have to do it now, Elijah," Sarah urged, her voice trembling. "They're going to kill them both." "The signal was for dawn," Elijah hissed, his eyes wide with fear. "If I light it now, Thorn will see. He'll know it was us. He'll come for us next." "He is coming for all of us sooner or later," Sarah countered, her voice gaining a surprising strength. "That boy, he told you what Thorn did. He looked you in the eye and asked for one thing, not for you to fight, just to light a fire, to hold up a lamp in the darkness. What is our life worth if we let fear make us cowards in the one moment that matters?" Elijah looked from the firefight to his wife's determined face, and then to his daughter, who was watching him with wide, trusting eyes. He thought of the cattle Thorn's men had laughed about driving into the ravine. He thought of the exorbitant protection fees Thorn charged every homesteader. He thought of the years of swallowed pride, of looking away, of telling himself it wasn't his fight. Silas and Leo were now fighting back to back, a strange duo of grizzled age and ferocious youth. The outpost was a ruin, smoke starting to curl from the roof where a lantern had been shot and shattered. They were down to their last few rounds. Silas's shoulder ached from the kick of the old rifle. Leo was reloading a pistol they'd recovered from Jedediah's men, his small hands moving with an eerie, practiced efficiency. "They're getting ready to rush us," Leo said calmly, peering through a crack in the wall. "He's consolidating his men on the west side." "Then this is it," Silas said, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He had run from his past for 12 years, but here, in the ruins of his solitude, defending a boy who was the living embodiment of that past, he finally felt free. He would not die a hermit. He would die a soldier. Not yet, Leo said again, and this time there was a new note in his voice, a flicker of hope. He was looking, not at Thorne's men, but far beyond them, towards a distant dark ridge. Just a little longer. Come on, Elijah. Have courage. Marcus Thorne sat on his horse, watching the destruction with cold satisfaction. This was how you maintained power. Not with negotiation, but with overwhelming, terrifying force. You made an example of one, so that 100 others would fall in line. "Cease fire!" he bellowed. The guns fell silent. The sudden quiet was jarring. "Old man, you have one final chance. Your home is burning. Your life is forfeit. Throw out your weapons and send out the boy. You have my word. You will live to see the dawn." Inside the smoldering outpost, Silas looked at Leo. The boy's good eye was still fixed on that distant ridge. For a moment, Silas saw the fear return, not for himself, but the fear that his plan, his great gamble, had failed, that his faith in the battered souls of this valley had been misplaced. And then, it happened. On the distant ridge to the north, a pinprick of light appeared. It grew, blossomed, and then roared to life. A massive bonfire, a pillar of flame tearing a hole in the night sky. Marcus Thorne saw it and frowned in irritation. Fools, some homesteader lighting a brush fire at a time like this. He was about to give the order for the final assault when another fire erupted on a different ridge to the west, then another to the east. Within a minute, the entire valley was being ringed by a chain of colossal signal fires, a necklace of defiance strangling the darkness. The silent, terrified community had spoken, not with guns, but with light. Thorne stared, his mind failing to grasp what he was seeing. This wasn't random. This was coordinated. This was a message, and it wasn't for him. Leo let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. A real, genuine smile, bright and pure, finally broke through the mask of scars. "There they are," he whispered. Silas followed his gaze, not to the fires, but to the spaces in between. Out of the darkness, silent figures began to emerge. They rose from ravines, crested hills, and materialized from behind rock formations where they had been waiting. They were on foot, their movements quiet and purposeful. Each man was thin, worn, and bore the marks of past battles on his face or body. They carried rifles with a grim familiarity. One man had a prosthetic arm, another walked with a permanent limp. They were the ghosts Thorne had tried to bury. They were the scarred regiment. Thorne's men saw them at the same time. A wave of confusion and panic swept through their ranks. They had come for a simple siege against two people. They were now surrounded, their positions exposed by the very fires the homesteaders had lit. They were caught in a perfectly executed trap. "Form a perimeter! To the rocks!" Thorne roared, his composure finally cracking. But it was too late. A single rifle shot echoed from the south, clear and sharp. It was the signal. The scarred regiment opened fire. Their shots were not the wild, suppressive fire of Thorne's thugs. They were the measured, aimed shots of disciplined soldiers. Every bullet found a mark. Thorne's hired army, a mob of bullies and mercenaries, disintegrated into chaos under the precise, vengeful fusillade. Silas and Leo burst out of the burning outpost, adding their own fire to the battle. The hunters had become the hunted. Men who had ridden in with arrogant pride were now screaming, fleeing into the darkness, only to be met by more gunfire. The battle was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. In the end, only one man was left on horseback, Marcus Thorne. He sat frozen, his empire of fear collapsing around him in a matter of minutes. His men were dead, wounded, or had thrown down their guns in surrender. He looked at the ring of silent, scarred men closing in on him. He looked at the burning outpost, and then he saw Silas, walking towards him through the smoke, his face grim, his eyes burning with a righteous fury 12 years in the making. Thorne snarled, drew his pistol, and aimed it at the approaching figure. He never fired the shot. From the side, a rock flew through the air with incredible speed and accuracy, slamming into Thorne's hand. The pistol spun away into the dust. Thorne cried out, clutching his shattered knuckles, and stared at his attacker. It was Leo, standing tall, his face illuminated by the flames of the outpost, no longer a boy, but a giant. Silas reached the horse, grabbed Thorne by his fine coat, and hauled him from the saddle. The powerful landowner landed in the dirt with a pathetic thud. Silas stood over him, the rage of a dozen years churning within him. He could end it right here. One blow. It would be justice. But as he looked down at the pathetic, groveling man, he saw the faces of the community beginning to emerge from the darkness. Elijah, the homesteader, walking hesitantly forward with his family. Others followed. They were no longer hiding. They were witnesses. Silas took a deep, shuddering breath and let the rage subside, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. He wouldn't give Thorne a warrior's death. He would give him something far worse: accountability. "Get him on his feet," Silas said to the approaching men of the regiment. "We're taking him to the federal marshal in Fort Laramie. He's going to stand trial. For the payroll, for the ambush, for everything." Marcus Thorne looked up, his face a mask of disbelief. "You can't prove anything," he spat. Leo walked forward and stood beside Silas. He looked down at the man who had murdered his father. "We are the proof," he said simply. He then looked out at the assembled homesteaders, their faces lit by the signal fires they had bravely lit. "They are the witnesses." The sun rose on a valley transformed. The smoke still rising from Silas's ruined outpost was not a sign of defeat, but a beacon of change. The members of the scarred regiment, their long hunt finally over, were already helping the homesteaders round up Thorne's captured men. The silence of fear had been replaced by the quiet, purposeful sounds of a community reclaiming itself. Silas stood with Leo, watching it all. His home was gone, but his solitude had been a prison, and its walls had finally been broken. He felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Elijah. We can help you rebuild," the homesteader said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's the least we can do." Silas nodded, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in over a decade. "I'd like that, Elijah. I'd like that very much." His outpost would be rebuilt, not as a fortress of solitude, but as a meeting place, a trading post that served a community of neighbors, not a collection of strangers. He had lost his peace, but he had found a purpose. Leo stood beside him, watching his brothers, his family, not as ghosts of a shared trauma, but as the founders of a new life in the valley they had liberated. The scars on their faces no longer seemed like marks of tragedy, but symbols of an unbreakable bond, a testament to their incredible resilience. They had turned their deepest wounds into their greatest strength. Their story reminds us that the deepest scars are not always visible, and the quietest people often carry the heaviest burdens. But it also shows that the courage of one can become the conviction of many, and that a single light, bravely lit in the darkest night, can guide an entire community back to hope. The spirit of the West lives on in tales like these. To hear more stories of unlikely heroes and the enduring power of justice, subscribe to our channel and become a guardian of their legacy.